Here to talk more about the war, Dan Perry, a former Europe, Africa, and Middle East editor for the Associated Press, who is also joining us live from Tel Aviv. Sir, thank you for your time. Tell me about your experience in Tel Aviv over the last 24 hours.
Well, just as Robert was saying, I mean, it's sirens all the time, explosions overhead, debris occasionally falling on streets nearby where I live, and the family huddled together in a stairwell and rather agitated. But there is a tremendous sense of agony across Israeli society where almost everyone knows someone somehow affected by all this, whether killed, injured, or abducted. There is a sense of tremendous foreboding because, of course, there is likely to be action in Gaza. There may be contagion in the north with Hezbollah. There may be action in West Bank if the Palestinians choose to stage an uprising as part of all this. At the same time, I think there is an understanding in Israel that Hamas is not the Palestinians, Hamas is not the Gazans. Hamas is a barbaric terrorist group that Israel probably was unwise in acquiescing to its rule in Gaza. There was a notion that Israel could contain them in Gaza, and it was somehow acceptable because, as Robert says, Iron Dome more or less zaps these rockets out of the sky. That's no longer tenable. That was proven to be a catastrophic miscalculation by the right-wing government that preferred Hamas in Gaza because it had the effect of weakening the Palestinian Authority in West Bank.
Hamas is still hiding launch sites between and beside schools, including a kindergarten. From your perspective, have media outlets been reporting the whole story?
I used to be the Middle East editor of AP. I was in charge of the coverage out of Gaza. I face the same criticism. I can tell you it isn't easy. I can tell you reporters on the ground, Palestinian Gazan reporters on the ground, who are living in a police state and have all kinds of pressures on them, are heroes, nothing less than that. That said, I do think the global media, to be true to its status as a public good, if it really wants to report the first draft of history and not propaganda, does need to treat with more skepticism any numbers or any narrative coming out of Gaza, since it is safe to say the territory is ruled by a brutal and nihilistic organization that, given that it's clearly capable of raping and torturing and burning to death children, probably is not above lying to journalists. And that needs to be factored in a way that is, I think, perhaps more profound than we have seen from some major news organizations.
And we're still seeing those images. You can't deny the blood. You can't deny the violence. And at the same time, knowing that Hamas is using these civilians as human shields, it's not the first time.
I really don't envy the decision makers because there are no good options. Israel could hold off and do nothing. And, various parties have advised that Israel seek other options. I myself have written op-eds suggesting there are options to a ground invasion. That said, I don't think that we can expect the Israelis to tolerate the continuation of what had been the status quo ante until October 7th. And I do think that they are trying to minimize civilian casualties. I realize that's no consolation to people who are affected. I have friends who are affected, and the whole thing is a horrible calamity. I can only say that if they do succeed in replacing Hamas with a rational government in Gaza, that will be a favor, first and foremost, to the unfortunate people of Gaza.
Dan Perry, we appreciate you joining us. And again, our best to you and your family living there in Israel.
In what ways does the war highlight a false conception in your eyes?
Well, the right-wing government in Israel basically, with plausible deniability, approved of Hamas being in charge in Gaza, even though they are a terrorist group dedicated to Israel's destruction, because they thought they could contain the conflict to occasional rounds of rockets and Israeli retaliation. There's been like 5 of them in the past 16 years. And that Israel could somehow survive this, and it doesn't really matter that 2 million people under the boot of terrorists in Gaza, I mean the Gaza Palestinians. They assumed that there would never be a successful invasion. That obviously collapsed completely on Saturday. A lot depends on internal politics in Israel. This government has taken just a tremendous body blow with the incompetence that they've displayed, with the apparent correctitude of claims that the schism they'd caused in Israel was going to tempt enemies to attack. There's going to be talk of an emergency unity government. And if that happens in Israel, that may be a signal that a dramatic action is to come.
In fact, you say there will be a reckoning for Netanyahu.
I should think so. I mean, the series of mistakes that he has blundered into and the calamitous 10 months of his premiership should be tough to bounce back from. But then again, he's a political Houdini and he knows how to frame a narrative, and I would never, ever count him out.
You say it is time for new ideas in the Middle East, and you recently wrote, "Everything that was tried has been a litany of failure." What do you believe right now is the least bad option?
Putting aside the cost of it, I do assess that Hamas must be defeated in Gaza, primarily for the Gazan people. Almost 2.5 million people have had to live under this insanity for 16 years, where having a beer will land you in jail and being gay will get you killed. And every couple of years, they poke a much bigger bear in the eye and have this happen. So Hamas has to go, and I think what follows ultimately will be Palestinian control run by the Palestinian Authority, and I hope they one day get independence in a state, not just autonomy. And I do suspect it will require some form of international involvement, probably a multinational force, to help the Palestinians pacify Gaza, or at least keep the peace, and perhaps an Arab League force as well. As for the protests in the West, honestly, I think a lot of the protesters I've seen are the useful idiots of the global jihadi movement. If you are pro-Palestinian, if you want the Palestinians to have a state, if you want oppression of the Palestinians to end, and all of that is totally legitimate, and I share it myself, then you need to be against Hamas, not for Hamas. Hamas's raison d'etre since the beginning, 30-some years ago, was to prevent a partition of Palestine. Their view is to eradicate Israel and replace it, and not with a Palestinian state, but with an Islamic theocracy that will be part of the global jihadist movement. And to see progressives in the U.S. and on campuses actually supporting this nihilistic terrorist group, thinking that's what being pro-Palestinian is a sad thing to behold. And I honestly don't know their motivation. I think some of it is anti-Semitism and a lot of it is ignorance.
I mean, I would say a lot of it is uneducation or a lack of education.
How do you view the fear of widening the conflict if you do move in aggressively and occupy Gaza City and the entire, well, and a lot of the Strip?
It still exists, of course. But what happened today was actually what passes for good news in this region, because Hassan Nasrallah, while he didn't exactly praise the U.S. or Israel, stopped well short of declaring that Hezbollah would join the fray. And the fear had been, as you alluded, Connell, that when Hamas carried out the extreme action that they did, they knew Israel would come after them in Gaza, and they anticipated that it would become a regional conflict with Iran's other proxy movement, Hezbollah in Lebanon, joining in. That was the fear. The nightmare scenario of a total regional conflagration includes the U.S. Then potentially taking action against Iran, and who knows what that would lead to. What we saw today, to a degree, suggests something positive, which is that Hezbollah was itself surprised by what happened, and that they are currently holding fire.
Well, listen, you've covered it for a long time and been there analyzing that region for a long time. So if you say it passes for good news in the region, we'll take it, I suppose. Thank you, Dan.
All things are relative, Connell.
Exactly. Exactly. Not an endorsement, but it passes for good news on a day like this. Dan Perry, live from Tel Aviv with us today.